Hello there, listeners of the History of the 20th Century podcast. My name is Zach Twomley from When Diplomacy Fails podcast, and today I would like to give you a special introduction to something that your humble host, Mark Painter, has been working on for quite some time, the Russo-Japanese War. You may remember the Russo-Japanese War. It was that war I attempted to cover a good time ago. Episode 3, I think it was. It was the episode which featured wonderful imitations of Russian accents by yours truly, but it was also an episode that I had been really looking forward to doing for some time, and in fact, its contents and its events are still things that fascinate me to this day, and were I to redo an episode, that would come in a close second to the Franco-Prussian War, of course, because Bismarck. But yeah, the Russo-Japanese War is an incredible event. It's a really important one for what's to follow because it seriously weakens Russia, it empowers Japan, it empowers Germany, and it makes Britain act a little bit more free in the international system. This series of events that Mark Painter is about to paint for you guys could be described as the fertilizer of the First World War. But don't take it from me, take it from Mark Painter himself, and enjoy the first of a multi-parter series on the Russo-Japanese War. Thanks for stopping by, and if you haven't already, cheap plug, I hope you check out When Diplomacy Fails podcast. Thanks very much for listening to me, and I'm sure Mark Painter is very happy that you're listening to him as well. Now, let's put our feet up and relax as we listen to the world getting a little bit more dangerous in 1904. Enjoy.
Imperial Russia's eastward expansion, which has been going on for centuries, reached all the way to the Pacific Ocean and beyond into North America by the 18th century. But these Russian territories in the Far East were distant, barren, and of little economic value. During the 19th century, Russian expansion turned south, annexing outer Manchuria from China and extending Russian territory on the Pacific coast as far south as Korea. There the Russians founded a city and called it Vladivostok, the ruler of the East. At the same time, Japan was embarking on its ambitious and brilliantly successful effort to modernize, enlarging its influence and hoping to be counted among the world's great powers. The Japanese, too, were expanding at the expense of the faltering Chinese Empire. It should surprise no one that these two ambitious empires would collide, and it should surprise no one that the flashpoint was Korea. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 31, The Ruler of the East. Today we begin the story of the Russo-Japanese War. Let's start with a little review of the situation in Northeast Asia. By 1860, Russia had annexed territories that had formerly been Outer Manchuria, the northeasternmost portions of China, including the island of Sakhalin, and had founded the port city of Vladivostok, which, as I have already pointed out, literally means ruler of the East in Russian, and gives you some clue about Russian intentions, as does the fact that a few years later the Russian government sold Russian North America to the United States. Clearly, Russia sees its future more in the southeast than in the northeast. This point was not lost on Japan, a country that sits squarely in the path of Russian expansion. While the Russians were building Vladivostok, the Japanese were restructuring their army along Prussian lines and their navy along British lines. As Japan began to look outward and to seek its own colonial expansion, her eye had fallen first on the Korean peninsula. Korea had traditionally been a tributary of China, but in the 19th century, as Western nations increasingly encroached upon Chinese sovereignty, to the Japanese government it began to seem only a matter of time before some European nation or another seized control of the Korean peninsula, which would place powerful and modern army and navy assets within striking distance of the home islands. Japan is a nation with limited natural resources, and was even at this time a net importer of food. The upside of Korea's proximity to Japan is that Korea at this time is a net exporter of food, and a source of coal and iron ore to fuel Japanese industrial expansion. In 1876, Japan forced the Korean government to open trade with Japan. The next 2 decades would see China and Japan jockeying for dominance over Korea, a competition which led to war between China and Japan in 1894, as I described back in episode 1. Most foreign observers expected Japan to lose that war. Yes, Japan had been modernizing, but so had China. Japan's surprise victory in the war demonstrated the superiority of the Japanese model of modernization and had left the Chinese government humiliated. From the point of view of the Russians, this war had 3 important consequences. First, China's new and modern northern fleet had been neutralized, leaving the Japanese Navy as the most powerful navy in Northeast Asia. Second, Korea is now under Japanese influence. And third, Japan has won a concession on the Liaodong Peninsula, the southern tip of Manchuria. All this matters to the Russians because the Russians have been busy expanding into Manchuria, the northeastern portion of China, so now Russian and Japanese ambitions are colliding. The Russians particularly objected to Japanese control of the Liaodong Peninsula. Shortly after the war ended, Russia intervened, with support from its ally France, and also from Germany, a country that was also alarmed by the rising strength of Japan. Kaiser Wilhelm had begun speaking of die gelbe Gefahr, the yellow peril. And let me pause here for a moment to take note of the invention of this stupid racist phrase, which would become popular among stupid racists for the rest of the 20th century. And for coining this stupid racist phrase, I would like to award this week's Kaiser Wilhelm II Award for making an ass out of yourself to Kaiser Wilhelm II. Anyway, those 3 powers, Russia, Germany, and France, applied diplomatic pressure to force Japan off the Liaodong Peninsula in an event known to history as the Triple Intervention. These 3 powers had more combined naval force deployed in East Asia than the entire Japanese Navy, so Japan had no choice but to back down. The Japanese abandoned the peninsula in exchange for a larger indemnity from China. But China needed to take out foreign loans to pay the indemnity they owed to Japan. The Russians assisted the Chinese in raising this money in exchange for concessions in Manchuria. The Japanese had scarcely left before the Russians started moving in. Germany forced China to grant it a 99-year lease on the ports of Chaozhou and Qingdao on the Shandong Peninsula in 1897. The British also won a lease on the port town of Weihaiwei, also on the Shandong Peninsula. You may recall from our discussion of the Boxer Uprising that these 2 Chinese peninsulas, Liaodong and Shandong, form the gateway to Beijing, the Chinese capital. The Russians were alarmed at this new presence, particularly the British, as at this time Britain and Russia regarded each other as their main adversaries. So the Russians then successfully pressured the Chinese to grant them the Liaodong Peninsula. This gave the Russians control of the strategic Chinese port town of Liushunkou, which is usually referred to in discussions about the Russo-Japanese War as Port Arthur. so I'm going to call it Port Arthur here, but let's keep in mind that it's a Chinese town that we're talking about. The Russians redeployed the bulk of their Pacific Naval Squadron from Vladivostok, which is east of the Korean peninsula and which freezes over 4 months out of the year, to Port Arthur, which is west of the Korean peninsula and which freezes over never. It is, in short, that holy grail of Russian naval planning, the open year-round, warm-water port. It seems the Russians were primarily motivated by a desire to counter German and especially British power in the region, but the Japanese saw the acquisition of the Liaodong Peninsula, which had been in their hands just 2 years ago, as a threat too big to ignore. And when we're considering the strategic situation in Northeast Asia, we need to pull back for a moment and take a look at the Trans-Siberian Railroad. As Russia expanded eastward, its efforts to colonize Siberia were being held back by the need to import basic necessities from China or Korea or through Pacific ports. The first railroad proposals in Siberia ran east toward the Pacific, and the Russian government saw a need for the Trans-Siberian Railroad as a way of keeping Siberia firmly linked economically to European Russia. And railroads, of course, were viewed as a crucial military asset at this time. Mobilization, meaning the ability to assemble an army and ship it to where it was needed as quickly as possible, was regarded as an important, possibly decisive factor at the beginning of a war. In theory, a working Trans-Siberian Railroad could scoop up huge numbers of soldiers in European Russia and deposit them in East Asia. The Emperor Alexander III ordered construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad to begin in 1891. By 1904, the project was all but complete. The one missing link was the route around Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal is a rift lake, meaning that it's a body of fresh water that has collected into a geological rift. It's about 400 miles long north to south and 30 or 40 miles wide east-west. It's more than a mile deep, and it's believed to contain 20% of the fresh water of the entire planet. Lake Baikal lies in the heart of Siberia. The surface of the lake is about 1,500 feet above sea level, and the mountains around it rise some 7,000 feet higher, which makes for spectacular scenery and should also help you to understand why the rail line around it isn't finished yet. It was a massive engineering project that would require 200 bridges and 33 tunnels before they got it finished. In the meantime, the Russians were operating icebreaker rail ferries across the lake, which could carry 28 railroad cars. That's when the lake is thawed. In the winter it freezes, and in the deep winter it freezes too hard even for the icebreakers. When that happens, the Russians draw rail cars across the ice by horse, if they aren't too heavy, and the soldiers, well, they can just march across the frozen lake, if they could stand the freezing conditions and the vicious winds that blow across this vast, flat expanse of ice. Oh, and did I mention that at this time the Trans-Siberian Railroad is a single-track line? The upshot of all this is that in 1904, the Russians can only send about 3 trains per day in each direction. Although, as the Russo-Japanese War progressed, the Russians invested a lot of effort in increasing rail capacity, and by the end of the war, they were managing to get 12 trains per day in each direction. And while I'm on the subject of railroads, this might be a good place to mention track gauge. The standard track gauge, meaning the distance between the rails, in most of Europe, and in China, and in North America, is 4 feet 8.5 inches, or 1,435 millimeters if you like. In Japan, they actually use a narrower gauge than this, because narrow gauges are more useful in mountainous terrain, which Japan has an abundance of. But when railroads came to Russia, they were seen from the beginning as a military asset, and Russian military planners worried that the empire's heavy investment in railroad tracks might be used against it someday by an invading army. memories of 1812 still lingered. So they got the bright idea of making Russian track gauge just a little different from standard track gauge. Russian track gauge is 1,520 millimeters, which is just a hair under 5 feet, or wider than the standard track gauge by about 3.5 inches, or 8.5 centimeters. This is just wide enough to make European rolling stock useless on a Russian track. And I mention this now because the problem of foreign armies trying to use Russian rail lines is going to crop up in this war and in wars to come. I mentioned that China gave Russia concessions in exchange for paying off her indemnity to Japan in 1895. One of these concessions was the creation of a railway, the Chinese Eastern Railway. The Chinese Eastern Railway crossed Manchuria east to west, eliminating the need to go around as the Trans-Siberian Railroad did, and this shortened the trip to Vladivostok by about 350 miles. Although the Chinese Eastern Railway was officially a joint project and it was on Chinese territory, the Russians ran the show and the line was built to the Russian track gauge. The Russians also got to build a town in central Manchuria, Harbin, and got to deploy Russian troops along the rail line to guard it. After Russia got control of the Liaodong Peninsula, it built the Chinese Southern Railway, extending from Harbin south all the way down to Port Arthur at the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, and also built to the Russian track gauge. It was now possible, at least in theory, for Russian soldiers to ride by train all the way from Moscow or St. Petersburg or any Russian city you care to name, right into Port Arthur. You may recall from our discussion of the Boxer Uprising that Japan and Russia were the two allied countries that contributed the largest numbers of soldiers, which is not surprising when you consider geography. I also mentioned that there were Boxer attacks on these two Russian-Chinese rail lines, and by the end of the Boxer Uprising, Russia had moved over 100,000 soldiers into Manchuria to secure these rail lines and had made a military headquarters in the city of Mukden on the Chinese Southern Rail line a ways south of Harbin. Under the terms of the Boxer Protocol, these troops were to have withdrawn from Manchuria by 1903. But there was a split of opinion in the Russian government over whether Russia should withdraw or use its military forces in Manchuria to guarantee Russian control of northeast China. The Russian finance minister, Sergei Witte, who was probably the smartest person in Russian government at this time, and certainly the one with the best grasp of what the empire could and could not afford, being finance minister, advocated withdrawal and argued that Russia could secure its interests in Manchuria by peaceful means such as trade and investment. But he was falling out of favor with the emperor by this time and was overruled in favor of the Hawks. In his memoirs, Witte recounts the story of how he was dismissed from his position. He recalls visiting with Emperor Nikolai for their weekly meeting, discussing the various items on the agenda, and at the end of the meeting the emperor spoke to him personally, praising his advice highly and telling Witte how much he appreciated all of his hard work and good counsel. Witte describes going back to his office feeling on top of the world after that meeting, and then arriving to discover a letter on his desk from the emperor informing him that his services were no longer required. Yeah, Nikolai was that kind of boss. And while I'm on the subject of the Russian government and the Russian emperor, I suppose now is as good a time as any to mention that I have a period recording here of the Imperial Russian national anthem, God Save the Tsar. For the past several episodes, I've been trying to figure out a way to work it into this narrative on Russia, and the moment never seemed right. And here we are at the Russo-Japanese War, so I guess I'll just drop it in right here. So here is the Imperial National Anthem, God Save the Tsar. Does that melody sound familiar to you? You can find it in a number of Protestant hymnals. It's the melody to God the Omnipotent and Christ the Victorious. And if that's not where you heard it, perhaps you know it as the tune to Hail Pennsylvania, the alma mater of my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. And if not there either, maybe you recognize it from the ending to Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. The brass section play it at the climax. God Save the Tsar hadn't actually been composed yet in 1812. But then the French weren't using La Marseillaise at that time either, so whatever. But back to the story. The failure of the Russians to withdraw from Manchuria on time, the way they promised, worried both the Chinese and the Japanese governments. Japan grew alarmed when Russian business interests began to buy up timber concessions in northern Korea, which to the Japanese looked an awful lot like Russian encroachment into the last barrier between them and the home islands. You might be thinking that it doesn't make a lot of sense for the Russian Empire to be risking war with Japan for the sake of a few adventurers making some money off of timber concessions in northern Korea. But these adventurers were Russian aristocrats, and in Russia, aristocrats get their way. In particular, there was this fellow named Bezobrazov, which is ironic since his last name is derived from the Russian word for disorder. But anyway, he organized a bunch of aristocrats, including relatives of the emperor, and formed the Russian Far East Timber Company. A number of members of the royal family, including the emperor himself, were shareholders in this company. And the idea was that they were all going to make a killing harvesting timber along the Yalu River. Well, the company went bankrupt, and Russia and Japan got into a war. So, that's aristocracy for you. But during the time when these guys thought they were going to make a killing harvesting timber, the Russians were actually deploying more armed forces into forward positions in Manchuria along the border with Korea at a time when they were supposed to be withdrawing, so you can imagine what the Japanese thought about that. The initial Japanese response to all of this was to open negotiations with the Russians toward the goal of delineating their respective spheres of influence in Eastern Asia. The negotiations did not go well. The Japanese were hoping for some kind of deal where the Russians would recognize Japanese interests in Korea in exchange for Japan recognizing Russian interests in Manchuria. But as 1903 drew to a close, it became clear to the Japanese that the Russians were stalling for time. The hawks in the Russian government just didn't believe Japan was that big a threat. The emperor and his advisors felt that Russia had all the military force it needed already in place to repel a Japanese attack. Russian military planners were contemptuous of the Japanese, who were often referred to in Russian government meetings as monkeys and worse. Because, hey, the key to sound decision-making is always to rely on crude and ignorant racism. The only fly in the ointment, from the Russian point of view, was that piece of the Trans-Siberian Railroad around Lake Baikal that just wasn't finished yet. Hence the stringing along of the Japanese at the negotiating table. The Russians figured if they could just stall long enough till the rail line got finished, then all their problems are solved. But while the Japanese understood the risks of war with Russia, they considered Russia's continued expansion an existential threat to Japan, and they were not willing to go down without a fight. 10 years earlier, the Japanese had won a war against China that few independent observers thought they could win. And it's worth mentioning the experience that Japan got out of that war. Everything that Japan had learned to do in 1894, establish naval supremacy, execute amphibious landings, and support and resupply soldiers on the Asian mainland, were exactly the skills it was going to need to beat Russia. Russia, by contrast, had not fought a war since the Russo-Turkish War in 1877, which was now 26 years ago. You'll recall that in 1902, the Japanese signed an alliance with Britain. Under the terms of this alliance, Britain and Japan had agreed to support each other in the event one of them found itself at war with more than one other country. So in other words, if Japan gets into a war with Russia, Britain has no obligation to get involved unless some other country intervenes in the war on Russia's side. Then Britain is committed to assist Japan. The Japanese still remember the Triple Intervention from 1895. By 1903, it seems less likely that Germany would still support Russia, but France and Russia had an alliance going, and it's still going strong. The Anglo-Japanese alliance meant that France, or Germany, could only intervene militarily on Russia's behalf at the risk of war with Britain. That was good news for Japan, but there was still one wild card left in the deck: the United States. As you are now well aware, the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898, seized control of the Philippines in 1899, and got involved in the Boxer Uprising in 1900. The United States was clearly flexing its muscles in the Western Pacific, and its attitude toward the Russian-Japanese rivalry was unclear. The U.S. Secretary of State, John Hay, had articulated an American policy toward China that had come to be called the Open Door Policy. Basically, the Open Door Policy proposes that China should be kept as an independent nation and that all foreign powers should be able to trade with China on an equal footing. You could read the Open Door Policy as American opposition to European imperialism in China. Though if you want to be uncharitable, you could read the Open Door Policy as the United States resentful that it didn't get a piece of the Chinese pie, and so is demanding that the other colonial powers allow the United States to exploit China on an equal basis. Either way, the other colonial powers grudgingly accepted the Open Door Policy, but in 1902, Secretary Hay protested that those Russian troops deployed in Manchuria after the Boxer Uprising were inconsistent with the agreed-upon principles of the Open Door Policy. Hay probably never considered what effect this protest was having on the government of Japan, but the Japanese viewed it as a welcome indication that the United States was leaning toward its position. And so, by the beginning of February 1904, the Japanese government, having given up on negotiations, decided the time to strike was at hand. On February 5th, the Meiji Emperor reluctantly approved. Japan ended its negotiations and severed diplomatic relations with Russia that very day. The commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet was Togo Heihachiro, who had trained in the Royal Navy, attended the Royal Naval College at Greenwich, and was a veteran of the Sino-Japanese War. On the 5th of February, Togo ordered a squadron of 10 destroyers to attack Port Arthur. The next day, the rest of the combined fleet, 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, 30 destroyers, and 40 torpedo boats, followed after them, with Togo himself in command from his flagship, the British-built Mikasa. Meanwhile, 4 Japanese cruisers were escorting transports carrying 3,000 Japanese soldiers to the Korean port of Chemulpo, better known today as Incheon, the very same place where the Japanese had landed at the start of the Sino-Japanese War 10 years earlier. The transports arrived on February 8th and began debarking troops. There were 2 Russian warships in the harbor, as well as British, French, American, and Italian ships. The Russians and the Japanese took no actions against each other, as Chemulpo was a neutral port. But the following day, after a failed attempt to escape, the Russians scuttled their ships. The main Russian naval squadron in the Pacific was stationed at Port Arthur. It was composed of 7 battleships and 6 cruisers. a force comparable to Togo's combined fleet, which was basically the entire Japanese Navy. The commander of the naval base at Port Arthur and of the Pacific Fleet was Admiral Oskar Viktorovich Stark. The Japanese arrived late in the day on February 8th. Admiral Stark had taken reasonable precautions. 2 Russian destroyers were patrolling outside the harbor, and just inside the harbor, 2 cruisers had their newfangled searchlights trained on the harbor entrance. The admiral had ordered all ships to put out anti-torpedo netting, although not all of the ships had yet complied with this order. And this particular evening, many of the fleet senior officers were attending Mrs. Stark's birthday party. The patrolling Russian destroyers spotted the approaching Japanese destroyers shortly before midnight. The Russian destroyers were under orders not to engage, but returned at once to the harbor to report. In the time it took them to do that, though, the Japanese destroyers had already entered the harbor and begun attacking. Most of the Japanese torpedoes got snagged in the torpedo nets, but there were 3 torpedoes that did make contact hits on valuable targets: the battleships Cesarevich and Retvizan, and the cruiser Pallada, all 3 of which grounded in the muddy bottom of the harbor. At dawn the next morning, Japanese reconnaissance reported turmoil inside the harbor, and so Admiral Togo sent the whole fleet into Port Arthur. But it turned out the Russians were in better shape than the Japanese had thought. The 2 fleets exchanged some fire, doing minor damage to each other, and the Japanese withdrew. Now, both of the admirals in command during this encounter have drawn criticism. Some naval historians believe that this battle could have been decisive for either fleet, had either one of the admirals attacked the other more aggressively. But Admiral Stark was unwilling to send his fleet out into the open sea, which would take them away from the Russian minefields and shore batteries that gave him a substantial advantage over what was otherwise an equal or possibly a little bit stronger Japanese fleet. As for Admiral Togo, he was in command of what was basically the entire Japanese Navy, and to gamble away the whole Japanese fleet on the first day of the war, well, that's a pretty big risk. The next day, Japan issued a formal declaration of war against Russia. The Russian government was incredulous that Japan would dare to attack it, and outraged that they would do so without declaring war first. Sympathetic European governments, such as France and Germany, backed the Russians on this, although there was at this time no formal requirement under international law that a declaration of war need be made prior to an attack. In Britain and the United States, countries that were more sympathetic to the Japanese, the surprise attack on Port Arthur was viewed as a masterstroke. So, hey, America, you're totally down with this sneak attack on a naval base without a declaration of war thing? Good to know. Just give me a minute here while I make a note of that. When the Second Hague Peace Conference gets held in 1907, that's the one that was supposed to be held this year, but will get postponed because, a war just started. The conference will agree on this principle, that from now on, a formal declaration of war must precede an attack. The results of the sneak attack on Port Arthur were not nearly as bad as they could have been. 3 Russian warships were out of commission, but they could and would be raised and repaired. But the psychological impact on Port Arthur was grave. Further Japanese attacks were expected, and the mood in Port Arthur approached panic. Russian civilians were packing the trains that ran north along the China Southern Railway to get to Mukden or Harbin in the interior of Manchuria, where the Japanese presumably could not follow. Chinese civilians, who were denied the right to buy tickets on these trains, fled the town by whatever means were at hand. On the next day, the 3rd day of the war, in an incident that would epitomize the mixture of bad luck and incompetence that would plague the Russian Navy for the rest of the war, the Russian mine layer Yenisei, on a mission to lay down a minefield outside the harbor entrance, struck one of its own mines and sank. A Russian cruiser was sent to investigate the accident because they suspected a Japanese submarine. It also hit one of the mines that Yenisei had just laid and also sank. Worse still, the only map showing the minefield that Yenisei had just laid went down with the ship. Now is probably a good time to point out the disparity in quality between Russian and Japanese sailors. Japan, of course, is an island nation with a strong education system. The average Japanese sailor during this time is literate, educated, and is likely to have grown up on or near a seacoast. Many of them have worked on fishing boats before joining the Navy. Russia, by contrast, is a vast land empire with a poor education system. The average Russian sailor at this time is likely to be illiterate and uneducated, and probably never so much as laid eyes on the open sea before joining the Navy. Admiral Togo and the combined fleet returned to Port Arthur 2 weeks later with 5 obsolete merchant ships. The plan was to sink the ships at the entrance to the harbor and bottle up the Russian Pacific Fleet inside. But the plan failed. The Russian shore batteries were able to fire on the merchant ships and sink them before the Japanese could get them into position, along with an assist from Retvizan. Retvizan still had a huge hole in her side and was sitting on the bottom of the harbor, but her guns are out of the water and they worked just fine. So don't count the Russian Navy out just yet. But the Emperor relieved Admiral Stark of his command that very same day. Fairly or not, and personally I think not, Russian opinion viewed the Japanese attack as a huge defeat and blamed the admiral. But if you're rooting for the Russian Empire, here's the good news. Stark's replacement would be the most brilliant commander in the Russian Navy, Admiral Stepan Osipovich Makarov. Admiral Makarov was a veteran of the Russo-Turkish War, where he had made a name for himself as the first naval commander in history to sink an enemy ship with that then newfangled invention, the self-propelled underwater torpedo. In the intervening years, Makarov contributed several new inventions to naval science, including an armor-piercing shell, a new kind of dry dock, and the first icebreaker. Remember that icebreaker rail ferry on Lake Baikal that I mentioned a while back? Yeah, he designed that. He also published a book on naval warfare. Admiral Togo thought highly of it and kept one with him whenever he went to sea. Makarov was also popular with the Russian sailors, who affectionately referred to him as Grandpa. Makarov's arrival at Port Arthur was just what the demoralized Pacific Fleet needed. The new commander got the fleet moving again. Regular patrols were organized. Ships were sent out on reconnaissance missions. Makarov got the crews busy on the 3 damaged ships and got all 3 of them refloated and moved into the dockyard where repair crews got to work on them. The sailors of the Pacific Squadron found themselves coming to grips with a strange and unfamiliar feeling: rising morale. The Japanese began to notice that when they fired on Russian patrols, the Russians were now shooting back, instead of merely scooting off for the safety of the harbor. On March 27th, Admiral Togo made his second attempt to sink merchant ships in the harbor entrance. Once again, the Russians successfully sank the merchant ships before the Japanese could get them into position. Take that, Admiral Togo. But let's not forget that Admiral Togo has read Admiral Makarov's book. On April 12th, the Japanese laid mines outside Port Arthur and laid a trap for Makarov. The next day, a squadron of Japanese cruisers attacked one of the Russian destroyer patrols. This was the bait, and Makarov took it. Using the battleship Petropavlovsk as his flagship, Makarov went after the attacking cruisers with his full battle fleet, the battleships Petropavlovsk, Poltava, Sevastopol, Pobjeda, and Peresviet, and 3 cruisers. But as the Russians closed with the Japanese cruisers, Makarov spotted the full Japanese fleet approaching. This could have been the decisive naval battle, with both fleets led by their ablest commanders, but Makarov didn't like it. He smelled a trap. The Japanese had 6 battleships to his 5, and many more cruisers and destroyers than were at the Russians' disposal. So Makarov made the prudent decision to turn back to Port Arthur, where the shore batteries would give him the advantage. But, as they approached the harbor entrance, Petropavlovsk hit a Japanese mine and sank in a matter of minutes, taking with it over 600 Russian officers and sailors, including Grandpa. Petropavlovsk had gone down so fast the Russians were convinced it had been sunk by a submarine, that much-feared high-tech naval weapon of 1904. In fact, both the Russian and Japanese navies had some experimental submarines, but neither side used them in this war. The panicked crews of the other Russian ships looked around, and suddenly every random bit of debris floating on the water looked like a periscope. Some ships began firing. Other ships began firing when they heard those ships firing. A few minutes later, the battleship Pobjeda also struck a Japanese mine, although it was able to make it back into the harbor with the rest of the fleet. One battleship sunk and one damaged was pretty bad, but the loss of Admiral Makarov was a catastrophe. The Pacific Fleet's morale was shattered, and there was no one left to rebuild it. Even Admiral Togo lowered his flag to half-staff and declared a day of mourning. It's important to keep an eye on the strategic situation. This cat-and-mouse game at Port Arthur is intended to tie up the Pacific Fleet so the Japanese can continue to move soldiers and supplies into Korea. Remember Korea? The Japanese have been unloading troops into ports along Korea's west coast this whole time. The number one priority for the Japanese is to prevent the Russian fleet at Port Arthur from breaking out and attacking those transports. So whatever the ups and downs of the naval actions at Port Arthur, the fact that the Russians were in fact not able to stop the Japanese from assembling 3 divisions in Korea counts as a Japanese victory. By the end of April, the Japanese First Army, with about 42,000 soldiers, was assembled in Korea and was marching north toward the Yalu River, the traditional border between Korea and now Russian-occupied Manchuria. But the Japanese are running out of time. So far, all the naval action has been in the Yellow Sea. That's because it's winter and it's too cold for operations in the Sea of Japan. But the harbor at Vladivostok is thawing out. Also, as the Japanese First Army is marching north in Korea, Japan is assembling its Second Army to make an amphibious landing in a much more daring location, the Liaodong Peninsula itself. You may recall I mentioned once before the port of Dalian, which is on the east side of the Liaodong Peninsula, about 30 miles, or 50 kilometers, north of Port Arthur. The Russians call this town Dalny, and so do most of the sources on the Russo-Japanese War, so I guess I'll follow suit. Dalny also has a nice harbor, and the Japanese have a daring plan. Instead of waiting for the First Army to make the long march west from Korea through enemy territory garrisoned by Russian soldiers, they intend to land the Japanese Second Army near Dalny and cut the rail line to Port Arthur, leaving Port Arthur blockaded by sea and besieged by land, with the Russians trapped inside. What makes this plan so daring is the proximity of the landing site to Port Arthur. A fleet of 70 unarmed merchant ships packed full of Japanese soldiers is already on its way to Dalny, less than 2 hours from Port Arthur. It is absolutely crucial that the Russian Pacific Fleet not be able to engage the transports. To this end, Admiral Togo made his 3rd attempt, on May 3rd, to sink some obsolete transport ships at the entrance to the harbor. This time, it has to work. The Japanese are running out of obsolete transport ships, for one thing. For another, failure to bottle up the Pacific Fleet would mean the invasion would have to be called off, and Japan would lose its best chance to isolate Port Arthur and begin a strike into Manchuria. It didn't work. For the third time, the Russians were able to sink the ships before they got into position. Port Arthur is still open, and the Second Army is almost to Dalny. What does Togo do now? Call off the invasion, and quite possibly go down in history as the Japanese admiral who failed his emperor 3 times and blew Japan's best shot at winning this war? What else can he do? Falsely report that he succeeded in blocking the harbor, then cross his fingers and hope that the battered and demoralized Pacific Squadron is too intimidated to take the offensive, and wait to see whether his little subterfuge costs the lives of thousands of Japanese soldiers? We'll have to stop there for today, but I hope you'll join me next week on the history of the 20th century, as Admiral Togo falsely reports that he succeeded in blocking the harbor, then crosses his fingers and hopes that the battered and demoralized Pacific Squadron is too intimidated to take the offensive, and waits to see whether his little subterfuge has cost the lives of thousands of Japanese soldiers. That's next week on the history of the 20th century. I'd like to say thank you to Zach Twomley for opening today's episode. Zach is the creator and host of the When Diplomacy Fails podcast, a podcast about, when diplomacy fails. Zach's particular historical interest is late 19th and early 20th century, and so his podcast covers a lot of the same conflicts that this podcast has or will cover, except with more of an emphasis on international relations and less of an emphasis on, track gauges. So if that sounds interesting, check it out, When Diplomacy Fails. Oh, and one more thing. Those of you who have read ahead in the history of the 20th century know that the Japanese are going to launch a similar surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941. In one of those eerie coincidences that history buffs love so much, the United States Chief of Naval Operations at the time was Admiral Harold Rainsford Stark. No relation. A court of inquiry would later criticize this Admiral Stark for withholding information on Japanese naval movements in late 1941 from Admiral Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, information it was thought might have helped Kimmel anticipate the attack. Stark died in 1972. Whether and to what degree he bears any culpability in the attack on Pearl Harbor is a question still debated today. The United States Navy commissioned a guided missile frigate, USS Stark, in 1982. While in the Persian Gulf in 1987 during the Iran-Iraq War, Stark was attacked and damaged by a surprise Iraqi missile attack. 37 U.S. sailors were killed and 21 wounded. The reason for the attack, and whether or not it was authorized by the Iraqi government, has never been determined. Stark was decommissioned in 1999. In 2011, the U.S. and Iraqi governments agreed on a plan for Iraq to pay compensation to the victims of the attack.